Hey everyone, hope everyone's doing well and staying safe these days. I want to actually go ahead and do a motherboard review here. This is actually a motherboard that I've actually been looking forward to getting my hands on, X570s chipset. And I'm actually looking into calling it not really a new chipset, but more of a variation of a former chipset, the X570 that came out over a year ago when the third and fourth generation Ryzen CPUs were introduced. And you can actually see here, this particular board is the MSI X570s Gaming Edge motherboard. You can actually see here that it is actually lacking the 30-40 millimeter fan here that actually is supposed to keep the chipset pretty cool down here. And one reason this is actually introduced is because that little fan, you may actually notice when your motherboard actually first posts, that fan can actually be a little bit on the loud side. It does eventually cool down, but if you're going to be overclocking or using PCI Express lanes quite often, particularly NVMe drives or your video card, etc., or overclocking, of course, that fan may actually turn on to keep things cool. So obviously here, you can see that this is more of a silent factor, and you can see that now we're actually using just pure heatsink, and it's actually much bigger. Now, one little thing for sure, I can definitely tell this motherboard has quite a bit of weight to it. So let's go ahead and take a quick look at this particular board, unbox it, even though it already is, but we'll go ahead and unbox it again, toss it into a computer, and do a little bit of a BIOS overview here. So this is the MSI X570s, I almost forgot that one, Gaming Edge motherboard. Let's go ahead and take a look. A closer look at the box over here, I do see that the actual notification here for the Ryzen 5000 desktop ready is not actually a sticker, but actually printed on the box itself. So definitely good news there. Let's go ahead and take a look at the back of the box as well too. Definitely looking forward to actually taking a look at this, the physical of this motherboard. A lot of USB ports there, a lot of options this particular new model chipset that can actually really offer you. And of course, just taking a look here at the back of the box, there's another little view over here. And of course, definitely mentioning the passive cooling that this particular motherboard actually has, as opposed to the X570 chipset that does have a little fan there. I've never actually noticed that fan to be too loud, but I guess if you're actually going to be overclocking or using, using the PCI Express lanes, you actually might get some little bit of fan noise. Let's go ahead and pop this open. Slightly different way of packing stuff. So I'm going to remove this, and if I'm correct, this is actually the Wi-Fi antennas in here. It's a little bit of a pain to open, and it looks like it is. There you go. Put that aside. Try to take this motherboard out, and I will tell you this board definitely has some weight to it. Bear in mind there is now no more fan, but more heatsink on it. So, oof. I can definitely tell you there's a lot of weight to this motherboard over here. Let's go ahead and put that aside for now. Take this off. Over here looks like, oops, actually it just fell here. Looks like we do have a little thumb drive here actually. Pretty interesting here. I'm going to probably take a guess this is probably a Type-C thumb drive, and I'm actually taking a look at the insides of the box here. I no longer see that DVD or CD that includes chipset drivers and other drivers for the components on this particular motherboard. So I'm going to actually take a guess that there's actually a little thumb drive here for you. Who knows how big it is, but I guess we'll plug it in later and take a look. Let's go ahead and look here. Looks like some LED related cables. Looks like two of them actually. Go ahead and take a look. Yep, this is another one right over here. So we got two of them. Two SATA cables over here. Looks like a little hex wrench. Actually, no, I apologize. Looks like a flathead and a little Phillips screwdriver right over there. Pretty interesting. This is actually kind of new. Trying to see if it does have, yes, it does have the little MSI logo right there. Some screws here for the M2 NVMe drives on the motherboard. This looks like a little bit of a sticker set. Pretty interesting. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, I believe. The little badge again, this one's actually just a little bit more of a flexible material. Before they used to have a little bit of a metal feeling. Some very amazing looking wire labels. You can actually connect these to your fan. It looks like some for fans, for RGB, and also for your SATA connections right here to actually give them a little bit of a label. These are actually color coded, but you can actually probably just write on here as well too. And of course, just a little bit of a rewards program here. I always keep joking I'm going to eventually get myself a little plush dragon, if they even have it. Thank you for choosing MSI, etc. Register your product, scan this QR code, etc., etc. Looks like a little bit of a booklet of products they do have as well. Pretty interesting. Shout out. It almost looks like one of those little promo cards you get to go to a club. Pretty interesting. Let's see what it says here. Looks like basically try to do user reviews, kind of like the review I'm doing right now for you guys. Pretty interesting. Looks like even a contest. Quick installation guide. Basically a fold out thing here to actually get your socket and everything installed. Heatsink. And of course a manual right here for your motherboard. This actually does look like pretty thin. It's kind of interesting. I've actually been commenting on a number of reviews lately that I really wish these booklets were much thinner because it looks like it actually is put into many different languages and the book ends up being about like over 100, 150 pages. Much thinner here, so definitely saving a couple little papers here and there. This board definitely has some weight to it. A lot more heatsink on it than fan, so you can definitely feel it. And here it is in all its glory. The biggest change on this particular motherboard here over the X570 chipset is basically the lack of the passive, basically the little CPU cooler here over the chipset. This small, like, I would say almost like a 30 or 40 millimeter fan that is over here. Now, usually when turning on the X570 chipset motherboards, basically for first boot, you actually do hear that fan revving pretty quick. So I can definitely understand it being quite noisy. I was about to say nosy. And I guess if you're going to be doing some overclocking or using a lot of the PCIe lanes, that can definitely probably get a little warm. So now we've switched over on this particular X570S chipset, S for silence. Now it's more of a passive cooling here, which seems like the big difference between this chipset motherboard and the former. Let's go ahead and start taking a look at some options here. You can definitely see one big difference, notable difference, is definitely more USB ports here. 1, 2, looks like about 8, 9, and 10, including the Type-C here. So 10 USB ports as opposed to the usual 8. 2 over here, these look like USB 2s. These are 3s, these are 3s, and of course you have the 3 and the Type-C as well too. Here of course are your Wi-Fi antennas. This motherboard does have Wi-Fi 6 and also Bluetooth as well too. Be sure to plug these in for Bluetooth as well, even if you plan not to use Wi-Fi. So here's your connections here for your antenna. Over here you do have 2 buttons here to actually flash your BIOS. I believe this option is here to flash your BIOS even if there's no CPU or memory present on the motherboard. Pretty useful when there's going to be a next generation AMD CPU if it actually is using the AM4 socket. And over here, of course, a button here to clear your CMOS in case you accidentally do some overclocking settings and they definitely do not work and your system does not post. Usually these motherboards actually have the option to basically revert back to the last usable posts and settings, and it'll definitely give you the warning that it obviously did not work this last time, but you do have this option right here. Here, of course, is an old-fashioned PS2 slot for any fans who are interested in installing Windows 7. And of course, here are your audio connections. Over here, your red one is supposed to be green. This is red for your regular stereo. Some other connections here for microphone and surround sound. And of course, your audio connection right over here. Of course, here's your LAN connection. This is actually a 2.5 gigabit LAN connection, which is becoming much more popular these days. And of course, here are your additional USB ports. So obviously, this motherboard does have the built-in I/O shield like that I absolutely adore and really we're growing to love, as opposed to the separate backplate that goes on the computer before you actually install your motherboard, and of course can be a little bit of a pain to actually install on occasion. Let's go ahead and take some further looks here on the board itself. Looking on the bottom here, we do see some connections here. Obviously, here's your front panel audio connection. Then you can go ahead and plug in any speaker or microphone connections on the front of the computer to this particular little connection here as well too. Right over here, looks like we do have an RGB cable connection in this particular area here. There's definitely multiple connections here, and I'll go ahead and show you another one, either 4-pin or 3-pin on this particular motherboard. We do have a system fan connection right over here. Some other pretty interesting connections in this area. Right over here, there is actually a thermal sensor connection here, which you may or may not be using, but the option is right there. This is actually a new connection I have not seen on MSI motherboards before, or any recent ones. So it looks like they're really tossing in on pretty much many options you can possibly have on this particular motherboard as well. So over here you do have some old-fashioned USB 2.0 ports. Looks like 2 of them right over here. You can go ahead and plug in any front panel connection that may be using it, or even one of the older ones that will actually connect to a bracket on the back. There are some devices that you can actually connect directly to these as well too. So that's another option if you actually have a device that actually uses that. Most of them are actually making way for the more dominant USB 3 connections, and here's actually your USB 3 connection for your front panel and any other devices you may actually have on the back. Some people actually do use USB 3 expansion cards, and here's basically your device that can actually power that up. A little bit further here, you have 2 more additional fan connections for both of them 4-pin. And of course, here are your connections for your front panel devices such as LED, hard drive, LED, and whatnot. Basically your power button as well, reset button. And up here in this 4-pin, these 4 pins you actually do see here are your old-fashioned speaker connection if you actually do plan to use it. Right over here you do have an LED switch. You can actually have the option to turn it on, turn it off. And it looks like over here we do see a 3-pin LED connection in this area here just below the heat sinks. I'm happy to actually say when we actually do turn here, we do see an additional USB 3 front panel connection here. MSI motherboards have actually had these particular connections, particularly the X570 chipsets. So it's really your choice whether this is a little more convenient or this other connection down here, but feel free to use both. Moving along here, we do have 6 SATA ports, total of them here. Most motherboards these days are actually cutting down on the number of the SATA ports available, since obviously the M2 drives for NVMe, which I'll definitely go over in a moment, are becoming more dominant and more popular in use these days, but you do have 6 ports here. And of course, definitely something I really enjoy about new chipsets and whatnot is, of course, the USB Type-C for USB 3 connection right over here. There are definitely converters that will allow you to use a Type-C to basically the old-fashioned USB 3 connection like this one, but this one specifically for that, and obviously you'll get the maximum and top speeds using this connection. A little bit further here, we do have the old-fashioned 24-pin power connector for the entire motherboard. Over here, we have 2 additional system fan connections here. It looks like it's a total of 5 so far I've actually seen, but there's going to be a few more. One for the CPU, and absolutely we can see them up here. One for the CPU, and it looks like one actually being used for any pump connection, but you can definitely use it as an additional 4-pin fan connection as well. And right over here, it looks like we have an additional LED connection. Actually, it looks like 2 of them. One's a 4-pin and one's a 3-pin in this section right over here. Just before I forget, looks like we do have obviously 4 DIMM slots here for your memory. So you can definitely go ahead and install them here for basically dual channel. And obviously these are not color coded, but you definitely can see in the manual which slots are actually used. Usually, ideally, it's going to be this slot here and this one that I actually just moved the little flaps for. Here we do have a slightly taller and bigger heatsink. Just to the right of it, we do have the power connections for the CPU. You'll definitely be using one 8-pin power connection for the CPU, and you do have the additional 4-pin here if you plan to overclock your CPU or the CPU requires more power. We've already definitely gone over these ports right over here, and want to go ahead and actually take a good look at the motherboard itself. And as I mentioned, this particular chipset class here, it's actually done away with the little chipset cooler, like a little 30 or 40 millimeter fan that was right over here. Gone ahead for a more passive approach here, which some enthusiasts have actually mentioned that particular fan can get a little loud. A lot more heatsink here, and definitely adds a lot more weight to this particular motherboard. Connected here, looks like we have not 2, but looks like 1, 2, and 3 M2 slots for NVMe connections here. These top 2 should definitely be running at PCI Express Generation 4, but actually looks like this one will be running at Gen 4 as well too, as you can actually see. However, if you're going to be using only one of them, ideally to actually put it up here, but pretty interesting option that you can actually put them in any of these particular slots. Looks like this slot here is actually a little bit shorter, so just keep that in mind. If you're going to have one of the traditional NVMe drives, you'll probably want to put it over here, or in this particular section down here as well. Here, of course, are your PCI Express X16 Generation 4 slots. Looks like one here, and of course one here as well too. It's a little magic that the X570 chipset has a little over the other chipsets like a B550. You definitely do have everything running at Generation 4 speed. And of course up here, your amazing 2017 era AM4 socket over here. Is the next generation Ryzen CPU going to be using a newer AM5 socket? I guess we'll actually see. But pretty interesting, and big props to AMD for actually sticking to the same socket as they mentioned for at least 3 generations, and actually 4, it turns out. So that's basically it. A pretty good view of the entire motherboard, and a good little description of all the little connections on it. So let's go ahead and toss the CPU, some memory, plug this into a case, get it some power, and let's take a look at the BIOS. All right, so it looks like we do have a post here and we are now in the BIOS. Hope everyone enjoyed that quick little setup here with the build. I did actually originally run into an issue with the video card. It actually was not giving me any signal. I think that video card may actually be on its way out, so I went ahead and tossed in an older NVIDIA N980 Ti, also another card that's on the legacy side, but we do actually have posting right over here. So one of the first things you actually see here in the easy mode, MSI's motherboards usually have two settings, easy mode and advanced. So actually right now we are in easy mode. Go ahead and toggle between the two of them by clicking up here or just hitting the F7 key. We do see basically a quick summary here. Here's obviously our CPU, our 3.6 gigahertz Ryzen 3700X 8-core 16-thread CPU. Some other information up here as well too, including CPU temperature, motherboard temperature, your BIOS version, which is obviously very important, current memory size, and other options as well here. Do see also the BIOS mode at this time. This particular variation of the X570 chipset, the X570s, does have a pretty recent BIOS state, but I'm pretty sure that's probably a new version. Probably one or two of them haven't been updated pretty recently. Over here on the left side, we do have a couple of profiles here for your memory, obviously XMP options that come preset with this memory. And of course, another one here regarding the CPU as well. Go ahead and toggle them on just by hitting the little red button on each one. Just in the middle, we do have the boot priority. I went ahead and actually removed a couple of little devices here. So basically you can go ahead and turn on or just basically move around your boot priority. Obviously you do want your main hard drive to be the main device, and right now I just have the USB key for a thumb drive to actually be the second one here. So obviously if there's more icons, you can go ahead and move them around like this and control the order. Clicking onto the memory, you actually do see the memories. Currently we're using two G.Skill chips, both of these two DIMM slots here in the ideal position for dual channel. Obviously the other ones are currently showing as empty. They're currently running at a default 2133 megahertz, but I can go ahead and increase that to, I believe, the 3000 megahertz that these chips are actually rated for. Looks like they actually are. Under storage, we can actually go ahead and see what's actually plugged into the SATA ports or connected to the M2 slots. Right now we don't have any devices here, but you do obviously see all their current status. You'll see the particular model, and if right now, if it's a SATA drive, you'll see if the hot plug option is currently connected. I really can't see an M2 drive being a hot plug at this time. Go to fan info, you see a couple information for the CPU or pump fan. And on the right side, you obviously do see all your system fans if they are connected. If they're not, you will see a 0 RPM. But I believe in this case, we actually have number 2 and number 5 currently being used. And you'll see they currently have an RPM on each one. Under help, we do have some hotkeys to actually go ahead and jump to different settings in this section. Obviously, if you would just want to go ahead and just jump to one here, obviously you can go ahead and just click on the corresponding F key. Just below, you do have a couple of options. Basically, here's your M flash to go ahead and flash the motherboard up to a newer BIOS state. Sorry, that's a little bright here. Right now, it's asking if you will auto reboot and enter flash mode. And go ahead and have your thumb drive with the latest BIOS version basically saved on this. So you can go ahead and just continue here, and the motherboard will reboot into that setting that you can go ahead and change and update the firmware. Down here we do actually have a little favorites button that once we actually go ahead and click on, save a couple little hotkeys that we prefer to use to go ahead and jump into different sections of the motherboard setup. And down here we do have probably one of my favorite settings, basically the hardware monitor that allows you to go ahead and change fan versus temperature thresholds and go ahead and control your fan speeds and basically what triggers them to actually increase a certain percentage or so. You can obviously control the CPU, pump if you're actually using water cooling, and of course all these 6 system fans up here. On the bottom we do have some more options. Basically here's a LAN option ROM if you want to go ahead and boot up from your LAN drive to actually install Windows or any other operating system. Here we also do have the option to actually turn off or turn on the audio, built-in audio sound card. Basically your boot mode CSM versus UEFI over here. SATA mode HACI versus RAID. And of course actually go ahead and turn off or turn on, toggle the LED built in on the motherboard itself. That's basically it for the easy mode. Pretty much a quick walkthrough here. I'm going to go ahead and select over to advanced, just hitting the F7 key. you definitely have a much more broad number of broad options in this particular area. So obviously I am more used to actually using this particular area here. Let's go ahead and take a look. We obviously do have the familiar game boost options and the XMM profiles for the memory, the boot priority, and obviously this information up here will still remain. Once we go ahead and click on the left side to settings, we do obviously see some more options. Once we go ahead and click on system status, basically the same summary we saw a little earlier in easy mode. Go ahead and click on advanced. We do see some more options to actually control all the peripherals connected to this particular board. Sound card, basically turn off the Wi-Fi here or turn it on in this case. Go ahead and disable your sound card if you'll be using a dedicated sound card here. And also actually toggle the SATA ports to actually be a hot plug in this area. Under advanced, we do have some more options such as USB configuration, power management setup, Windows OS configuration, and of course some other options here. Secure erase as well if you want to go ahead and wipe out an SSD or an NVMe drive as well. Obviously, we'll be going through overclocking in just a moment, but bear in mind here, any overclocking changes you make could accidentally damage your system if you really don't know what you're doing. So just bear that in mind. This warning definitely reminds you, and I believe this warning does pop up in other sections as well. Back into settings, we go ahead and take a look at the boot area, where we can go ahead and control here in an old-fashioned way the boot order and also disable other devices as well. We can also go ahead and add more, and as you see as I'm adding them, they start to actually appear in this top section in this here. We can actually go ahead and change the boot mode as well too to actually basically include legacy devices as well. Pretty interesting if you plan to install Windows 7. Under security, we do have the option to put a password on the BIOS to actually make some changes. And if you do have a sensor, you can also put in basically to have the BIOS notify you if there's been intrusion or if the case has been opened. I know many brands like Dell and other brands actually have this option. Very important if you're going to be installing Windows 11. Basically your TPM, trusted computing settings in this area. You see pretty much a broad amount of options in this section. One little note I want to let you know that if you do have a slightly older MSI motherboard, maybe a B450 or B550 motherboard, go ahead and give the motherboard a BIOS update so you can actually go ahead and see all these broad options as well too. The reason I mention that is because when installing Windows 11 on a slightly out-of-date BIOS on the motherboard, it may actually not detect the TPM chip correctly. Given that the latest version will actually go ahead and give you all these sections here and allow you to go ahead and install the operating system normally. And we do obviously have the option to go ahead and click on save and exit, save or discard all the changes you just made, and other options here as well too. If you ever think you made something basically messed up on something, go ahead and just restore. This will restore to defaults as well. Moving along, we do have a little OC for overclocking button in this section here, where it does give you a much broader and vast amount of options here for CPU and memory overclocking as well. You also can go ahead and change the frequency of the memory. I can actually go ahead and change it to 3000. You can actually see that. But definitely much more options here, including voltage, timings, and other stuff. You really have to be really careful what changes you're actually doing here. Bear in mind, overclocking is actually pretty useful to actually get the best out of your hardware, but definitely know what your aim is when you're actually trying to overclock. Just trying to mess with random settings just because they're there can unfortunately cause some damage. Down here we do have the option for M flash yet again. Go ahead and flash your BIOS to a newer version. Moving back to the main setting here, we're going to go ahead and take a look at the right side. We do have OC profile where you can actually go ahead and save overclocking profile presets. And you do also have the option to load and save these to a USB thumb drive. This is pretty useful if you're actually going to be flashing your BIOS to a new version where the profiles may actually get wiped out. And you can go ahead and back them up and go ahead and reload them from a USB thumb drive. That's actually a really useful option. Hardware monitor, which we just actually covered a little bit earlier, same option here. And down here, very interesting enough, we have a little button that says beta runner, and actually I do see a little message that says give it a try. Looks like we do have a little option here for SSD testing. Looks like particularly aimed at the NVMe. And it looks like we do have a data link feature exchange. There is a cable included with this motherboard that is actually made for this particular option here. You can definitely look into that a little bit deeper as well too. And that's definitely a quick overview of the advanced option on this particular motherboard as well. And just taking another quick look here of the system itself while it's actually on. We do actually see that there's some LEDs coming from the bottom. And usually there is some actually on this side here as well too, just where the rear fan is and the backplate I/O shield is. But I actually do not see lights on this particular board here. Let me go ahead and turn it off and just turn it back on just for fun. So obviously we do have some just mostly lights on the bottom. We do have a number of LED connections on this particular motherboard, so that's something definitely to be welcomed if you want to actually spruce up the computer itself with lights all over the place. Well, I hope everyone enjoyed this quick little build here. Definitely not a newer chipset, so to speak, a bit of a variation, as I like to call it, because basically the one big change here, much more welcome, obviously USB ports, some more advanced options in the back, but the big change is obviously the lack of the little chipset fan on the bottom, which some feedback have actually mentioned that can be a little noisy when overclocking or some other options. So now we have a more silent solution going on here, just using much bigger heat sinks and no fan as well. Hope everyone found this video enjoyable. Definitely shoot a like and subscribe. I'll definitely be doing some more reviews and whatnot in the coming days and weeks. Thanks again for watching, and as always, everyone, stay safe. Bye-bye.